if we're being realistic, over the last few albums, and we can only judge you off your past body of work. And Drake, we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of what?
If you're reading this.
Yeah, maybe his best album. For me, Nothing Was the Same is my favorite Drake album. Like, we have these lofty expectations of Drake's music because of the body of work that he's given us. And unfortunately for a lot of us, his last few albums haven't necessarily been great.
When SSS For You came out, Drake, OVO, and all of their supporters may have felt they were winning. But it's now obvious that as the streaming data for this record comes in, we can see how this thing is doing. Many of the individuals who waited in line to hear Drake's comeback when this record first came out did so only to gauge how awful it would be. They did not stay for several listens. Drake's SSS For You album is significantly underperforming compared to what anyone would have predicted. Drake, PartyNextDoor, and everyone else that is close to them are in a downward spiral as a result of this, as they never imagined that their music would do so poorly. Please remember to subscribe and give a like before we take this further. The reason the Drake fans are still furious with me is because they don't want you to hear the truth. As I stated in my last video, there is no longer any room for debate on the decline in Drake's career and the change in hip-hop that has been the subject of discussion since Kendrick Lamar's victory in the beef, regardless of hip-hop or anybody else's perspective on the subject. Now that we have statistics to show us how well Drake's record is performing, they are nothing short of awful. This album had the worst first-day streams of any Drake album released in the past 10 years, with just a little over 56 million. However, when compared to the previous Drake album, For All the Dogs, which had 108 million opening day streams, this new album had nearly half as many listeners. Thus, the truth is that this is just awful, regardless of what you may say about it. It's ironic that Drake has completely lost the plot after attempting to utilize these same numerical tricks in his diss tracks to downplay Kendrick's level of competition and, more generally, to prevent himself from ever being surpassed by anyone. Not Like Us and Luther are still doing better than Drake's entire new album, in addition to Kendrick Lamar's music, which has been out for months, still surpassing all of the new tracks off this album. Despite the fact that it has released 21 new songs, Luther is still expected to top all 7 of the charts. Given that this is a Kendrick song and that it is melodically driven and performs far better as an R&B song than anything on Drake's most recent album, it is hilarious that this particular song is actually going to top the charts at the moment, despite Drake's numerous attempts to compete with it. In addition to this, Kendrick Lamar is still outperforming Drake and shattering all of his records, which will ultimately give him the greatest title available in this day and age. He has also released a new album and more than doubled the size of his repertoire. For the first time, a rapper will have more than 100 million monthly listeners, Kendrick Lamar. The fact that Kendrick has nearly 20 million more monthly listeners than Drake did at his height and has never compromised his ethics to do so is simply astounding. No matter how you define it, Kendrick is the best, whether you want to discuss quality, impact, or simply statistics. As Kendrick Lamar stated in his Super Bowl performance, this indicates that Drake and his team cannot fake that effect, regardless of how they attempt to rig the game. This album is still lagging behind other top artists at the moment, even if all of this makes Drake fans want to concede that Kendrick Lamar is winning too much, and that no one, not even the current king of rap, can match him off the momentum of the Super Bowl. Big names like Bad Bunny, who continues to outstream Drake overall, and The Weeknd, who made sure to inform the world that his new album, Hurry Up Tomorrow, still had the biggest streaming debut of the year thus far over Drake and Party's project, show how Drake is currently losing to a lot of other artists that he attempted to disparage. The fact that Hurry Up Tomorrow, an incredible record, performed better than SSS For You is not surprising, given that this R&B album is a strong contender for Album of the Year in every way. Even though Kendrick is one of the biggest artists right now, along with Bad Bunny and The Weeknd, if we look down the list and see how bad Drake is doing, his numbers aren't just low by his own standards or when you compare them to the biggest stars out. A lot of other rappers have surpassed him by a significant margin in their most recent work. In contrast to a record like Tyler, the Creator's Chromatica, which had over 80 million streams on its first day with just 14 songs, Drake's 21 songs have 21. This is a significant difference because the goal of releasing an album this length is to ensure that the streaming numbers remain high first. Tyler is currently defeating Drake in every category, including quality, impact, and the one thing Drake has always claimed, the numbers. This is happening despite the fact that Drake has been surpassed by other West Coast rappers. Furthermore, Eminem's most recent album did better than this Drake and Party record if we compare Drake to rappers who are decades into their careers. Even more hilarious than this, And to give you an idea of how low Drake has fallen, if we compare this collaborative album to another collaboration in Vulture's One, which had no industry support and was actively kept off the charts and performing well, it still managed to outperform this Drake and Party record, and it did so for several days. To put this album's poor performance into perspective, the second day streams for this record became much worse, dropping to around 30 million. A record like GNX actually had a spike in streams on day 2, reaching over 74 million, which demonstrates exactly how awful things are going. Ultimately, it is evident that Drake is no longer in the race to be the best rapper or artist in general, and he isn't even outperforming legacy stars. Regardless of their position in the world, Drake is therefore no longer on the A-list, or any other top list of the greatest musicians when you locate records that he can truly compete with in terms of performance. In a music industry where new releases receive a lot of attention and discussion, it seems like Drake has reached a point where no one is interested in listening to his music, at least after a brief initial listen. This is evident when you compare the album's performance on day 2 with Kendrick Lamar's older music, which is still performing exceptionally well in terms of streaming. The album SSS For You is simply awful and is dominating this age in the worst way conceivable, even when compared to other albums we have discussed that came and gone. The performances, with the exception of one Drake-rapped song, are so empty that they aren't really worth discussing because they are so forgettable. In regards to Drake's attempt to release a record that can compete with everything in the industry at this time, even for his new standards, where the bar has already been so low, choosing to release a record with such dull music, especially after the Kendrick feud, was among his worst decisions. Actually, the only thing that separates this album from For All the Dogs is that even though both are awful, at least on For All the Dogs, Drake at least knew how to create a conversation about his music, regardless of how good or bad it was. People would talk about the album's features, disses, and other activities. Here, however, the music is so unimpressive that, aside from stating that and examining its influence and impact on Drake's career as it stands right now, there is simply nothing to genuinely get you to think and discuss the majority of the whole song. With all of this, it's incredibly crazy to say, but it appears that Drake's career and everything he has stood for are coming to an end, because he just no longer has the capacity to inspire people to listen to his songs. The performance of this record was better than that of even a deluxe album released years ago, especially when compared to someone like SZA and the Lana Deluxe she released for SOS. Drake's defeat by almost everyone who attempted to cause him trouble is a stark reminder of the state of the world today, since this record hasn't actually had any hit songs yet. And because the main discussions about it are about how the Drake era is finished and how awful and dull the record is, nothing else is happening. I'm sure that things will grow even worse as additional album numbers are released and we can see how this thing aged. As we can already see from the narratives that are being pushed, Drake fans and OVO will undoubtedly attempt to deny the reality we are witnessing and will use their tried and true defenses to defend the man. However, this is just as bad of a way to take a loss as it was when Drake lost to Kendrick but refused to acknowledge it with Hard Part 6. Overall, this project was a bust, and if you're a true hip-hop fan, you can tell the difference between a truly groundbreaking album like GNX that captivates listeners and something as ridiculous and unmemorable as SSS For You that falls flat. Overall, Drake's detractors will refuse to acknowledge the severity of his current decline and will instead find excuses to defend his music. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that this album will not only be the most commercially unsuccessful release of Drake's career, but it will also mark a watershed moment in hip-hop and music history, marking the definitive end to an artist's reign. In light of everything mentioned above, please share your thoughts on Drake's final album performance. Do you find their severity shocking? And what do you believe will happen as we realize how awful this whole situation is? Do you think there will even need to be a discussion over whether Drake has experienced the greatest fall of any rapper in history if his album and career take a turn for the worse as they are now? Because if he does indeed collapse as badly as these numbers suggest, I believe we will need to have that discussion right now. If you watched the entire video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps me out. I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Check out the following video to discover how Drake made this album even more mediocre by delivering some of the worst jabs at Kendrick Lamar and Joe Budden, which would only make his demise seem more shameful.